On the 7th of December 1941, the Empire of Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The United States was suddenly involved in what would later become the bloodiest war in history. In the province of British Columbia, the war had a considerable impact on the Japanese residing in the province. Though this wasn't all in the same way. It actually had less to do with who they were, but rather where in the province they lived. In British Columbia, government and public suspicion of the Japanese population residing in the province peaked, following several decades of racial tensions. At the onset of the Second World War, there were 23,149 Japanese living in Canada. While this population was dispersed across the country's western provinces, the vast majority, some 95%, were living in British Columbia at the time. The metropolitan area of Vancouver was the most densely populated urban center for the Japanese, with 1941 figures showing that 9,299 lived in the area. That was roughly 40% of all the Japanese in the country. Eventually, a 100-mile boundary was established along the western edge of the province. Any Japanese living in the area would be relocated to internment camps or prisoner of war camps. Despite the fact that this was a substantial portion of the population, many of the Japanese living in the Vancouver area were second generation and had never stepped foot outside of the country, let alone to Japan. Many of those who were relocated were sent to internment camps set up in the province's interior. Some were sent to sugar beet farms on the Canadian prairies. Some were sent to POW camps in Ontario. There were also those who were deported following the war. While many know of the relocation of the Japanese residing in the province's 100-mile boundary, fewer know of what happened to those living outside of this boundary. In the interior of the province, the local Japanese were seen with less hostility. For instance, in the city of Kelowna, a sign which was prominently hung read, "City of Kelowna welcomes you, population 5,500, Coast Japs, you are not wanted, get out." The emphasis that this sign puts on the Coast Japanese is interesting. As mentioned previously, a number of the Coast Japanese were, in fact, second-generation Canadian who had never stepped outside of the country. While many of their interior counterparts were second generation as well, it is apparent that many of them still had close ties to the nation, which will be discussed further. What exactly was it about the Coast Japanese that made them the victims of this racial tension? Was it due to the heavy concentration of the Japanese? Maybe it was the belief that their proximity to the coast made them more likely to be Japanese agents. Whatever the reason, it seems that there is a clear distinction between the Coast Japanese and their interior counterparts. In 1944, the British and Australian forces were in need of people who were fluent in Japanese. British Columbia answered this call. 3 local Japanese men, Tom Tomiyama, George Uzawa, and Hikaru Chick Mori, were able to do what very few Japanese Canadians were allowed to do: serve on Canada's behalf in the Pacific Theater.
I graduated in 39. That fall, that's when the war started. All my schoolmates, male ones, most of them, they all joined the Air Force. Here we tried, I don't know how many times I tried, Air Force, even the Army. No, we can't take you, Japanese. So I gave up for a while. Well, until, when was it, 1945, when the RCMP came and saw your granduncle downtown. He picked me, and then she asked me if I knew anybody, and I said, the only one I know that went through school in Japan was George Fuzzy Uzawa. So we asked him. He said, "Oh yeah, I'll come." So the 3 of us, we joined together.
They were allowed to do this despite the fact that both Tomiyama and Uzawa both had close connections to Japan.
They were both born here, like I was, but when they're young, still before school even, their parents sent them back to the old country, Japan, to get an education. Like your granduncle and his sister were both sent back. And they went through all schools and came back as teenagers mostly.
Were these men perceived as less of a danger simply because they lived outside of the lower mainland? Did the fact that they lived in the province's interior mean that they had less of a connection to Japan? At the time that Tomiyama served in Australia, his brother, sister, as well as his mother lived in Japan, the nation that he was fighting against. Tomiyama himself was no stranger to Japan, as he had also completed both his primary and secondary school in the country, which is somewhat peculiar considering that this would have made his connection to Japan considerably closer than many of his coastal second-generation counterparts. With this example, it is clear that the inland Japanese were still very much connected to Japan, at least at a familial level. Despite this, they were still somehow seen as less of a threat. In fact, they were seen as an asset. Along with these three Nisei from Kelowna, it is evident that other Japanese who resided outside of the Pacific 100-mile boundary were seen as a valuable asset to the Allied war effort. In Roy Ito's book, We Went to War, Ito gives a list of Japanese-Canadian volunteers of the Second World War, which contains a corresponding list showing where the volunteers enlisted. This list ranges from communities in British Columbia to St. Andrews, New Brunswick. For those who had been interned, many of their most valuable possessions had been sold by the government. Unlike the situation in the United States, in which not all property left behind was confiscated and sold, for the Japanese Canadians, any property that was left behind, such as fishing boats, real estate, and other vehicles, were sold at incredibly low prices. This selling of the Japanese property took place in 1943, following an order in council to the custodian of alien property. This order directed the custodian to dispose of the property, despite the fact that in the year prior, Chairman Austin Taylor of the Security Commission had promised that any property left in the care of the custodian would be protected, stating, "We feel that it is in the interest of those evacuated to place their property under the custodian's control before leaving the protected area. Otherwise, he cannot protect the property during the absence of any person evacuated." Today, the Japanese population in the Vancouver area is only a little over 30,000. That's less than 2%. Of course, this is considerably less than the total population's makeup in 1941. When the war ended in 1945, these interior Japanese men returned back to their lives. For their coastal counterparts, however, they didn't have lives to return back to. The population suffered greatly in Vancouver. In 1941, the population was over 22,000. By 1971, it hadn't even reached 14,000 yet. For many, the war didn't really end until 1988, when the Mulroney government issued an apology as well as compensation for the losses.
Good evening. Japanese Canadians will remember this as the day when Canada finally moved to right a wrong committed against them 4 decades ago. It was during the Second World War. Thousands of people were forced into internment camps simply because they were of Japanese descent. They've been waiting ever since for an official acknowledgement of the injustice, and today they got it. An apology from the Prime Minister and compensation for their losses. Former internees call it a settlement that heals. Wendy Mesley begins our coverage in Ottawa.
I speak for members on all sides of the House today in offering to Japanese Canadians the formal and sincere apology.
It was the apology Japanese Canadians had waited more than 40 years to hear. In the gallery, they stood and cheered. NDP leader Ed Broadbent, whose first wife's family had been interned, was overcome by emotion as he read from a novel about life in the camps.
I cannot bear the memory. There are some nightmares from which there is no waking.
No one here pretends that $21,000 each will make up for the millions that were lost, or that an apology will make up for up to 7 hard years in the Kootenays. What they will do, the internees say, is prove to everybody that Japanese Canadians were good Canadians all along.